Hegel's political philosophy and its contemporary relevance. Chapter 3. The unresolved political problem of modernity. I would now like to turn to Jürgen Habermas' The Inclusion of the Other, in which one can indeed find certain affinities with Hegel's project, and, more importantly, a political theoretical problem that, in my view, remains unresolved to this day. Habermas, in his work Die Einbeziehung des Anderen, situates his analysis between the opposing poles of liberal and republican conceptions of democracy. According to the liberal view, the primary function of the democratic state lies in safeguarding the negative freedom of citizens, that is, freedom from interference in their autonomous and law-abiding conduct of life. The so-called night watchman state merely delineates the framework necessary to protect life, property, and economic prosperity. What stands in the foreground, as Habermas writes it, is, quote, the aggregation and enforcement of social private interests vis-à-vis a state apparatus that specializes in the administrative use of political power for collective goals, end quote. Elections, in turn, serve to sanction private interests on a state level. With a brief anticipatory glance at Hegel's philosophy of right, one might call such an understanding of politics inadequate, truncated, and politically untenable. Were this conception to equate civil society, which Hegel aptly described as the sphere of private needs, with the political and thus the universal sphere, the result would be nothing less than a category mistake. The sphere that mediates particular interests cannot possibly constitute the immediate foundation of a public order meant to mediate universal interests. Hegel's notion of ethical life, Sittlichkeit, the overarching and unifying sphere of the state, is closer to the republican conception. As Habermas describes it, the two spheres recognized in the liberal model, quote, the hierarchical regulatory instance of state sovereignty and the decentralized regulatory instance of the market, i.e., administrative power and self-interest, end quote, are complemented by a further dimension that he calls the level of solidarity. Essentially, this refers to civil society in its mediating role between state authority and economic structures. The safeguarding and emphasis of positive rights raise the voice of civil society to political significance, so that citizen participation approaches a form of transformation. Citizens are expected to articulate their private interests autonomously, to develop them into general interests, and thereby to rise to the status of responsible citizens. In contrast to the ideal of the night watchman state, where subjective rights are emphasized, the republican conception presents a stronger form of political order, objective right, since the community as such is better protected, at least in principle, from the encroachment of private and economic interests. Because state authority can be perceived as belonging to the people, the republican state, unlike the liberal one, succeeds in developing, quote, a concept of right that accords equal weight to the integrity of the individual and his subjective freedoms as to the integrity of the community, end quote, and at the same time, quote, binds the legitimacy of laws to the democratic procedure of the genesis, thereby maintaining an internal connection between the people's practice of self-determination and the impersonal rule of law." End quote. Whereas in the liberal conception, the state functions as a facilitator of preference-maximizing decisions by rational beings, it becomes evident that such an approach, reducing citizens to wandering calculators of utility, does not reach the depth of Hegel's idea of the modern state, according to which every decision, including legislation, must involve a certain measure of self-appropriation. Quote, "It is a great obstinacy, one that does honor to man, to refuse to acknowledge anything in this position that is not justified by thought, and this obstinacy is the distinctive feature of the modern age." End quote. The emphasis on subjective particular interests might be interpreted as a strengthening of the individual, yet the arbitrariness of these interests reveals why they cannot yield universally valid principles indispensable for social order, at least not if that order is to transcend mere contingency. The assumption of a rational being that organizes preferences according to utility calculations can likewise be unmasked as arbitrary. Why should such a definition of human nature not be viewed as an arbitrary stipulation? After all, one could just as easily defend or dismiss the opposite view, that human nature is cooperative and oriented toward the enhancement of happiness. Either claim amounts to mere assertion, and neither can exempt a resulting theory from the charge of arbitrariness. Moreover, this conception of democratic order offers no safeguard against the twin dangers of majority tyranny and minority domination. A majority may elevate its own particular goods, material or intellectual, to the status of general goods, thus turning its willfulness into raison d'etat, while a minority possessing sufficient means may equally present its preferred interests as the common good and manipulate the state to serve them. What counts as binding norm, therefore, depends on time, place, and the cultural and historical preferences of the given society. Norms thus acquire an ever-mutable, self-contradictory character, serving more as instruments for pursuing particular aims than as the expression of universal purposes. In short, a society based on particular interests cannot provide a universally valid justification for its principles and is therefore arbitrary in its foundations. This characterization may simplify the libertarian model, which justifies individual freedom through arbitrary particular interests, but it remains within the scope of this study, an apt and sufficient one. The Republican model, by contrast, comes closer to the modern principle mentioned above. It favors an objective legal order associated with the community rather than the primacy of subjective rights, and thus advocates an order grounded not in particular but in universally shared preferences. The strengthening of the state's position as guarantor against the excessive influence of economic forces on social life is achieved through the institutional enhancement of citizens' participatory rights and through renewed emphasis on the principle of community, the balancing function that Hegel described as characteristic of the system of needs. The state thereby evolves from night watchman to arbiter. Yet the impartiality of this arbiter must again be questioned, particularly since even if it appeals more strongly to the will of the people than does the liberal model, where certain economic principles such as market orientation remain virtually untouchable, the underlying legislative structure may still be exposed as an arbitrary mechanism cloaked in the guise of universality. If the liberal model could be described in Hegelian terms as the equation of civil society with the state, then the Republican model approximates a modern constitution to the extent that it allows elections and participation, yet in a far greater degree and with stronger institutional mechanisms for social influence, while curbing the quasi-omnipotence of economic forces. As Habermas puts it, quote, "A concept of right that accords equal weight to the integrity of the individual and his subjective freedoms, and to the integrity of the community in which individuals mutually recognize each other both as an individual and as members, is at least approximated by the Republican concept." End quote. In contrast to the liberal model, where rights are primarily private, the Republican model subjects them to the collective participation and communication rights of the legislative process. It thus formally guarantees self-determination over the res publica and integrates individual, particularly economic, freedom into the communal context. According to Habermas, the output of this political communication is justified by the fact that the input, the will formation process of the citizens, is translated into law through the administrative power of the state apparatus via feedback and self-confirmation. This can be described as a democratic process loop. The advantage over the liberal conception lies in the separation of economic aspects of life governed by utility calculations from other spheres, a phenomenon that, as Marx observed in his theory of alienation, had permeated all human relations in modernity. In that condition, human relations assumed the form of economic ones, in which competition and utility replaced cooperation and love. By contrast, this separation preserves, quote, "the self-organization of society through communicatively united citizens," end quote, and prevents the aims of society from being conflated with the particular goals of the sphere of needs. On the other hand, Habermas warns that an excessive focus on ethical ideals can overlook the empirical realities of social life, particularly the persistence of private interests that elude moral discourse. Moreover, the categories of power and sovereignty, especially in the modern paradigm of the state of exception, risk being hollowed out when overly idealized. A further problem lies in the absence of secure, non-arbitrary foundations for decision-making. As in the critique of the liberal model, neither the tyranny of the majority nor that of a determining minority can be fully ruled out, since, quote, "the democratic process depends on the virtues of citizens oriented toward the common good," end quote. This dependence transfers contingency from political discourse to the societal and even universal level. Politics and contingency, however, can hardly be separated. Politics is, by its nature, the realm of contingency par excellence, the marketplace of opinions and interests to be balanced through norms, rights, and duties. Yet such a balance, if it is to be truly neutral and just, must arise from procedures that do not themselves already contain substantive or arbitrary premises. As we have seen, the liberal model disqualifies itself through its own foundational assumptions, while the Republican model becomes entangled in overly ethical discourses that cannot encompass the political in its entirety. Moreover, the volonté de tout may easily masquerade as the volonté générale, transforming itself into an abstract, self-perpetuating entity that undermines order when, quote, "the radical democratic self-organization of society," end quote, is elevated to a governing principle. In Hegel's words, quote, "the universal will is its pure knowledge and willing, and it is universal will as this pure knowing and willing," end quote. If we apply a structural philosophical lens rather than an empirical one, such a conception contradicts every fixed institution or faction. Expressed in less technical but perhaps more politically relevant terms, Habermas concedes that an empirical reference point for deliberative politics arises, quote, only when a common will is generated not merely through ethical self-understanding, but also through compromise, interest balancing, purposive rationality, moral justification, and legal coherence, end quote. The common will is thus no longer examined in its structural form, but in its procedural unfolding within the framework of a constitutional democracy. Habermas therefore focuses on, quote, the conditions of communication and procedure, end quote, and analyzes an intrastructural input-output machine. His discourse theory seeks to develop the most ideal basis possible for balancing interests through communicative processes. In this way, Habermas hopes to expand the Republican conception such that, quote, in the citizen's practice of political self-determination, the community becomes conscious of itself as a whole and through the collective citizen acts upon itself, end quote. As the earlier critique of the Republican model's dependence on civic virtue already showed, Habermas must find a way to unite virtue, need, and raison d'etat. His conception thus aims at as an institutionally anchored process of communication and participation that calibrates social forces and interests while remaining democratically legitimate. Discourse theory, as he writes, quote, abandons altogether the consciousness philosophical models that tempt one to attribute citizens' practice of self-determination to a collective subject, the Republican reading, or to relate the anonymous rule of law to competing individual subjects, the liberal reading, end quote. Habermas thus seeks to transform these consciousness philosophical models into figures of philosophical self-consciousness. Following Hegel, one can characterize both reading as one-sided absolutations of either the subjective or the objective ground of determination within the concept of the political and specifically within democracy. The subject, the individual citizen, perceives the object, that is, the state and its institutions, as something wholly external, a foreign power. Hegel describes the result. Quote, it becomes evident that such a consciousness provides an utterly inadequate and corrupting form for the absolutely necessary and eternal content of right and ethical life, for it gives to the necessary and universal the shape of something finite, particular, and external to itself. End quote. This internal one-sidedness leads to serious real philosophical distortions that manifest empirically as misallocations of power and resources. The result is a conception of the state that risks reverting to Thomas Hobbes' vision. Quote, the great Leviathan, so we call the state, is an artificial man, though of much greater stature and strength than the natural man, for whose protection and happiness it was created. End quote. Well, what is needed, therefore, is a structure capable of encompassing the concept of the political and specifically of the democratic in its entirety, a structure that reflects the real philosophical form of self-consciousness. Only such a conception can mediate between one-sided extremes. On the one hand, the state as an overpowering subject, the Republican view. On the other, the individual as a powerless being subjected to the necessity of market forces, the liberal view. In other words, a political philosophy lacking a logical foundation inevitably degenerates into unconscious and alienated relations of material rather than spiritual determination. As Christian Georg Martin insightfully writes in his analysis of the mechanics of spirit, quote, Mechanism treats relations of distinct, externally connected units within a continuum that is the sphere of one's own self unfolding. Mechanical objects are thus distinct entities that, though not entirely unrelated, are stretched together into a whole as sections of a continuum. Against this background, a certain aspects of personal and spiritual being can now be understood." End quote. This description serves as a metaphor for the political theories discussed thus far. The relation between ruler and citizen, between the individual and the universal order of the state, still corresponds to the logic of mechanism, the counterpart to consciousness. As long as this relation remains mechanical, as, quote, sections of a continuum stretched together into a whole, end quote, the inherent unity between people and state, between popular sovereignty and institutional power, cannot be explained. The relationship continues to appear external, and despite constitutional formulas such as, quote, all the state authority emanates from the people, end quote, political reality seldom rises above a mechanical, hierarchical order. The integration of deliberative elements and the people's will into the state structure thus remains superficial. Because the underlying structure of consciousness persists within the political system, such lofty proclamations remain artificial, only partially reflected in the lived reality of the civic sphere. Implicit, however, is that the people's subject and the state object are stretched together into a whole in themselves. This, in my view, constitutes the fundamental structure from which the level of self-consciousness must logically develop toward a political philosophical conception that corresponds to this structure and transcends it. Only in this way can the constitutional article, quote, all state authority emanates from the people, end quote, be understood organically, allowing us to move beyond the mechanistic framework of modernity.